The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Riverside High School as Elena Rodriguez stepped out of her mother's old Honda. She clutched her worn backpack tighter, feeling the familiar knot in her stomach that came with being the new kid. Again. "You'll be fine, mija," her mother said softly, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "This is a fresh start for all of us." Elena nodded, forcing a smile. Fresh start. That's what her parents kept saying ever since Dad got the promotion that moved them 3 states away from everything she'd ever known. 3 states away from Whitmore Academy, where everyone knew her as the girl who could make a piano sing like an angel. The hallways of Riverside High buzzed with typical teenage energy. Students laughed at lockers, rushed to classes, and moved in those familiar social clusters that every high school seemed to have. Elena kept her head down, navigating to the main office where a friendly secretary handed her a schedule and a map of the school. "Don't worry, dear," the woman said with a warm smile. "Everyone's nervous on their first day. You'll fit right in." Elena wasn't so sure about that. At her old school, fitting in had never been an option. She was always Elena the pianist, Elena the prodigy, Elena who had to miss parties because she had competitions, or Elena who couldn't hang out after school because of practice. She'd been performing since she was 6, and by the time she was 16, her entire identity had become wrapped up in those 88 black and white keys. But that was the old Elena. This Elena just wanted to be normal. Her first few classes passed in a blur of introductions and sideways glances from curious classmates. By the time she reached her music class, 4th period, Elena had already decided on her strategy. She would be invisible, unremarkable, and definitely not the girl who could play Rachmaninoff with her eyes closed. The music room smelled like old sheet music and instrument polish. Posters of famous composers lined the walls, and Elena couldn't help but notice they had a beautiful grand piano sitting in the corner. Her fingers twitched involuntarily, muscle memory begging her to go touch those keys. "All right, class, settle down," called Mrs. Patterson, a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a flowy skirt and had the kind of artistic energy that most music teachers seem to possess. "We have a new student joining us today. Elena, would you like to introduce yourself?" Elena stood up slowly, feeling 20 pairs of eyes on her. Hi, I'm Elena Rodriguez. My family just moved here from California." "Wonderful. And what's your musical background, Elena? Do you play any instruments?" This was the moment Elena had been dreading. At Whitmore Academy, this question would have been answered with a long list of achievements, competitions won, and prestigious performances. But Elena had made a decision during the long drive from California. She was tired of being defined by her talent, tired of the pressure, the expectations, and the way people looked at her like she was some kind of musical robot instead of just a teenager. "Not really," Elena said quietly, sitting back down. She caught Mrs. Patterson's slightly disappointed look and felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. "Well, that's perfectly fine," Mrs. Patterson said, though her tone suggested she was already categorizing Elena as another disinterested student. "Music is for everyone, regardless of experience level." The rest of the class was spent going over basic music theory. Elena found herself having to consciously dumb down her responses, pretending not to know the difference between a major and minor scale. When Mrs. Patterson asked the class to identify different instruments playing in a classical piece, Elena bit her tongue instead of immediately recognizing it as Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 11. "That's a piano," called out Jake, a boy sitting 2 rows ahead. "Very good, Jake. Anyone know what specific piece this is?" Elena's hand almost shot up before she caught herself. She knew it by heart. She'd performed it at Carnegie Hall when she was 14. Instead, she shrugged along with the rest of the confused faces in the room. At lunch, Elena found an empty table in the corner of the cafeteria. She unwrapped the sandwich her mom had packed and tried to look busy reading a book. It wasn't long before a few girls from her music class approached. "Hey, you're the new girl, right?" asked a friendly redhead named Lily. "Mind if we sit?" "Sure," Elena said, grateful for the company even though part of her wanted to stay invisible. "So California, huh? That must be so different from here, said another girl, Ashley. What school did you go to? Just a regular high school, Elena lied smoothly. Nothing special. Mrs. Patterson seemed disappointed that you don't play anything, Lily observed. She's always trying to recruit new talent for her performances and competitions. Elena's stomach clenched. Competitions. The word brought back a flood of memories. Standing ovations, judges' scorecards, the weight of expectation crushing down on her shoulders. I'm just not really musical, she said. That's cool, Ashley said. Not everyone has to be. Mrs. Patterson can be a bit intense about it sometimes. She acts like music is life or death. If only they knew, Elena thought. For the first 16 years of her life, music had felt exactly like life or death. Every performance, every competition, every practice session had carried the weight of her family's sacrifices and her own future. Her parents had worked extra jobs to pay for her lessons and travel to competitions. They'd moved their entire lives around her talent, and she'd felt suffocated by the responsibility. That afternoon, Elena walked home instead of taking the bus, needing the extra time to think. The houses in their new neighborhood were smaller than what they'd had in California, but there was something comforting about their ordinariness. No one here knew about her past, her achievements, or her talent. She could just be Elena, regular teenage girl. When she got home, she found her parents in the kitchen, unpacking the last of their boxes. How was school, Mija? Her father asked, looking up from a box of kitchen supplies. Good, Elena said, which wasn't entirely a lie. Different, but good. Her mother studied her face carefully. You seem lighter today, more relaxed. Elena realized she did feel lighter. For the first time in months, she hadn't spent her day worrying about perfect technique or whether she was living up to everyone's expectations. She'd just been a regular student in regular classes with regular problems. I think I'm going to like it here, she said, and meant it. Later that evening, as Elena sat in her room doing homework, she could hear her parents talking quietly in the kitchen. She caught fragments of their conversation through the thin walls. She seems happier, her mother was saying. I know, but I worry we made the wrong choice, her father replied. All that talent, all those years of training. She needed a break, Roberto. You saw how stressed she was getting. The panic attacks, the sleepless nights. Elena closed her textbook and lay back on her bed. Her parents were right. She had been falling apart under the pressure. The final straw had been the night before a major competition, when she'd had such a severe panic attack that she couldn't even touch the piano keys without her hands shaking. The irony wasn't lost on her that in trying to escape music, she'd ended up in music class anyway. But maybe that was okay. Maybe she could learn to enjoy music again without the crushing weight of perfection hanging over her. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Elena made a promise to herself. She would keep her secret, blend in with her classmates, and finally, experience what it felt like to be a normal teenager. No more competitions, no more expectations, no more being defined by her talent. What Elena didn't know was that keeping such a big secret would prove to be much harder than she imagined, especially when music had been woven into the very fabric of who she was for so long. And she definitely didn't know that Mrs. Patterson was already forming opinions about her that would soon lead to a challenge Elena never saw coming. For now, though, she was just Elena Rodriguez, regular high school student. And for the first time in years, that felt like exactly who she wanted to be. 3 weeks had passed since Elena started at Riverside High, and she was finally beginning to feel like she belonged somewhere other than behind a piano bench. She'd made friends with Lily and Ashley, joined the study group for her history class, and even went to her first high school basketball game. For the first time in her life, she was experiencing what it meant to be a regular teenager, but all of that was about to change. All right, class, Mrs. Patterson announced on a particularly bright Monday morning. I have some exciting news to share with you all. Elena looked up from her notebook where she'd been doodling music notes without even realizing it. Old habits died hard, apparently. As you know, our annual spring showcase is coming up in 6 weeks, Mrs. Patterson continued, her eyes sparkling, with the kind of enthusiasm that made Elena's stomach drop. This year, instead of having students volunteer for performances, I'm assigning each of you a piece to work on. Consider it a mandatory final project. The classroom erupted in a mixture of groans and nervous chatter. Elena felt her palms start to sweat. A mandatory performance meant there was no way to stay invisible, no way to avoid the spotlight she'd been desperately trying to escape. Now, Mrs. Patterson said, raising her hand for quiet. I'll be assigning pieces based on your individual skill levels and what I think will challenge you appropriately. Some of you will be singing, others will play instruments, and a few might even try their hand at composition. Elena's mind raced. She could claim she didn't know how to play anything well enough for a performance. She could say she had stage fright. She could even fake being sick when the showcase came around. There had to be some way out of this. Mrs. Patterson began calling out names and assignments. Ashley, I'd like you to work on the way you look tonight for vocals. Jake, you'll be doing a drum solo piece we'll select together. Lily, how about for Elise on piano? It's perfect for building your technique. Elena watched as her friends received their assignments, some looking excited, others terrified. When Mrs. Patterson called her name, Elena felt like her heart might beat right out of her chest. Elena Rodriguez, Mrs. Patterson said, consulting her list. I've been thinking about what would be best for you, and I've decided to give you a real challenge. Elena's mouth went dry. What kind of challenge could Mrs. Patterson possibly have in mind for someone she thought had no musical background? I'm assigning you Chopin's Etude Op. 10 No. 4 in C-sharp minor on piano. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She knew that piece intimately. It was one of the most technically demanding etudes in classical piano literature. She'd performed it at competitions when she was 15, and it had taken her months of intensive practice to master. Mrs. Patterson might as well have asked a beginning swimmer to compete in the Olympics. Mrs. Patterson, Elena said, her voice coming out as barely a whisper. I don't think I can... Nonsense. Mrs. Patterson interrupted with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I believe in challenging my students to reach beyond what they think they're capable of. The worst thing that can happen is you try your best and learn something new. Elena looked around the classroom and saw the mixture of pity and amusement on her classmates' faces. She could practically hear their thoughts. Poor Elena, getting stuck with an impossible piece because Mrs. Patterson wants to make an example out of her. But Mrs. Patterson, Jake called out, isn't that piece like really hard? I mean, even for people who actually know how to play piano? It is challenging, yes, Mrs. Patterson replied, but Elena will have 6 weeks to work on it, and I'll be providing extra practice time and resources. Sometimes we don't know what we're capable of until we're pushed. Elena felt trapped. If she protested too much, she'd draw even more attention to herself. If she tried to explain that she actually could play the piece, her secret would be out and she'd be right back where she started, defined entirely by her musical ability. I expect everyone to take this seriously, Mrs. Patterson continued. These performances will count as 30% of your semester grade, and parents and faculty will be attending the showcase. I want you all to make me proud. As the class ended and students filed out, Elena remained in her seat, staring at the sheet music Mrs. Patterson had placed on her desk. The familiar black notes seemed to mock her from the page. She knew every measure, every difficult passage, every fingering that made this particular etude so notorious among pianists. Elena, Mrs. Patterson's voice interrupted her thoughts. I know this seems overwhelming, but I have faith in you. Sometimes students surprise themselves when they're truly challenged. Elena looked up at her teacher, seeing what she thought was genuine encouragement in the woman's eyes, but there was something else there too, a kind of satisfaction that made Elena wonder if Mrs. Patterson actually expected her to fail spectacularly. Why this piece? Elena asked quietly. Why not something easier? Mrs. Patterson sat down, in the chair next to her, her expression becoming more serious. Elena, I'll be honest with you. In my 25 years of teaching, I've seen a lot of students coast through my class without really applying themselves. I get the sense that you're capable of more than you're showing me. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. Did Mrs. Patterson suspect something? I've noticed little things, her teacher continued. The way you unconsciously tap out rhythms, How your eyes track the notes when I play examples. The fact that you always know the answers even when you pretend not. 2. I think you're hiding your light under a bushel, as they say. Elena forced herself to maintain eye contact while inside she was panicking. I really don't think I can do this piece justice, Mrs. Patterson. That's exactly why I chose it, Mrs. Patterson said with a smile. I want to see you try something that scares you. Even if you only manage the first few measures by the showcase, you'll have learned more about music and yourself than if I'd given you Mary Had a Little Lamb. As Elena walked to her next class, the sheet music clutched in her sweaty palm. She felt like she was walking toward a cliff. Her carefully constructed new life was about to collide with the old one she'd tried so hard to leave behind. At lunch, her friends immediately wanted to know about her assignment. Chopin? Ashley said, nearly choking on her sandwich. Elena, that's insane. Mrs. Patterson has totally lost it. I looked it up on my phone, Lily added, shaking her head. There are videos of professional pianists struggling with that piece. What is she thinking? Maybe she's trying to make an example out of me, Elena said, which wasn't entirely untrue. Show the class what happens when you don't participate enough. That's so unfair, Jake said, having joined their table. I mean, I got assigned a drum solo, which is scary enough, but at least I actually play drums. This is like asking someone who's never run to complete a marathon. Elena nodded along with their outrage, but inside she felt like a fraud. She wasn't the victim they thought she was. She was someone living a lie, and now that lie was about to be tested in the most public way possible. That afternoon, Elena walked home slowly, her mind churning with possibilities. She could tell Mrs. Patterson the truth about her background, but then she'd be right back to being Elena the prodigy, Elena the pianist, Elena who wasn't allowed to just be a regular teenager. She could refuse to perform and take the failing grade, but her parents would want to know why, and lying to them felt worse than lying to her classmates. Or she could do what terrified her most. She could perform the piece. But if she played it the way she knew how to play it, with all the technique and artistry she'd developed over years of training, everyone would know she'd been lying about her abilities. Her secret would be out, and her chance at a normal life would be over. When she got home, Elena went straight to her room and closed the door. She spread the sheet music out on her desk and stared at it, memories flooding back. She remembered the first time her old teacher, Dr. Volkov, had introduced her to this etude. This piece will teach you about precision and control, he'd said in his thick Russian accent. But more importantly, it will teach you about passion restrained by discipline. Elena traced the notes with her finger, her muscle memory already anticipating the fingerings. She could hear the piece in her head, every note exactly as she'd played it dozens of times before. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Elena? Her mother's voice called. Dinner's ready. Coming, Mom, Elena replied, quickly folding up the sheet music and stuffing it into her backpack. As she sat down to dinner with her parents, Elena realized she was going to have to make a choice. She could continue living her lie and somehow fumble her way through 6 weeks of fake practice, disappointing everyone, including herself. Or she could find a way to be honest about who she was while still maintaining some control over her own life. But right now, sitting at the dinner table with her parents talking about their days, Elena wasn't ready to make that choice. She wasn't ready to go back to being the girl who lived her entire life in service to her talent. What she didn't know was that the choice might not be entirely up to her anymore. Elena stared at the ceiling of her bedroom at 2:47 a.m., wide awake for the third night in a row. The Chopin sheet music sat on her desk like an accusation, and no matter how hard she tried to push it from her mind, she could hear every note playing, in her head with perfect clarity. It had been a week since Mrs. Patterson had given her the assignment, and Elena was running out of ways to avoid the inevitable. She'd managed to deflect her friends' questions about how practice was going with vague responses about working on it and taking it slow, but she knew that soon enough, someone was going to want to hear her play. The worst part was how much her fingers ached to touch piano keys again. Living without music had been harder than she'd expected, Sometimes she caught herself playing invisible keyboards on her desk during class, or humming melodies under her breath. Music wasn't just something she did, it was woven into who she was, and trying to cut it out completely was like trying to stop breathing. Finally giving up on sleep, Elena slipped out of bed and padded quietly through the house. Her parents had unpacked most of their belongings by now, but there were still a few boxes in the garage that hadn't found their proper homes yet, including one box that Elena had been deliberately ignoring. She flicked on the garage light and found what she was looking for in the far corner, covered by an old sheet. Her heart hammered as she pulled the fabric away, revealing the upright piano her parents had insisted on bringing, even though there wasn't really room for it in their new house. It was nothing like the beautiful grand piano she'd grown up playing, or the pristine concert instruments she'd performed on. This piano was old, slightly out of tune, and had a few keys that stuck if you didn't press them just right. But when Elena sat down on the wobbly bench and placed her fingers on the familiar keys, it felt like coming home. She played a simple C major scale first just to feel the weight of the keys under her fingers, then a few arpeggios, muscle memory guiding her hands through patterns she'd practiced thousands of times. The sound was muffled in the cluttered garage, and she prayed it wouldn't wake her parents. Before she could talk herself out of it, Elena opened the Chopin sheet music and placed it on the rickety music stand. She didn't really need it. She knew the piece by heart, but seeing the notes on the page felt like reconnecting with an old friend. The first few measures flowed out of her fingers like water. This etude was all about rapid, precise passages, played with both hands, creating a cascade of sound that required incredible technical control. Elena's hands moved across the keys with practiced ease, her body remembering exactly how to balance speed with accuracy. But as she played, something unexpected happened. For the first time in months, Elena felt truly like herself again. Not the carefully constructed, normal teenager she'd been pretending to be, and not the pressured prodigy she'd been trying to escape. Just Elena, making music because she loved it, because it was part of her soul. She played through the entire piece twice, losing herself in the familiar technical challenges and emotional depths. When she finally stopped, her cheeks were wet with tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "That was beautiful, mija." Elena spun around to find her mother standing in the doorway to the house, wrapped in her bathrobe with tears in her own eyes. "Mom, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you," Elena said, quickly closing the piano lid. "You didn't wake me. I was getting water and heard the music." Her mother came into the garage and sat down on an overturned box. "I haven't heard you play in months. I'd forgotten how much I missed it." Elena felt a familiar stab of guilt. Her parents had sacrificed so much for her musical education. Her father working double shifts to pay for lessons, her mother driving hours to competitions and recitals, both of them rearranging their entire lives around her talent and schedule. "I know you needed a break from performing," her mother continued gently, "but I didn't realize you'd stopped playing entirely. Music used to make you so happy." "It did," Elena admitted quietly. "But then it became this burden. Everything I did had to be perfect. Every performance mattered so much I couldn't just play for fun anymore." Her mother nodded, understanding. "Your father and we got caught up in your success too. We pushed you because we were proud, because we wanted you to have every opportunity. But maybe we forgot that you were still just our little girl who fell in love with piano when you were 6 years old." Elena remembered that day clearly. She'd wandered into the music store while her parents were looking at guitars for her older brother, and she'd been mesmerized by the baby grand piano in the corner. When the salesman let her touch the keys, she'd played a simple melody she'd heard on the radio, figuring out the notes by ear. That was the day everything changed. "What's this piece you're supposed to play for school?" her mother asked. Elena laughed bitterly. "Chopin's Etude Op. 10, number 4. My music teacher assigned it to me because she thinks I don't have any musical background. She wants to challenge me to try harder." Her mother's eyebrows shot up. "That's the piece you played at the Young Artist competition when you were 15. "I know. It's ironic, isn't it? I'm being punished with a piece I've already mastered." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, surrounded by boxes and the lingering echo of music. "Elena," her mother said finally, "what if you didn't? Have to choose between being a prodigy and being normal? What if you could just be yourself, someone who happens to be incredibly gifted at piano, but is also a regular teenager with regular problems and regular friendships?" "I don't know how to do that, Mom. At my old school, being good at piano was all anyone saw. I was never just Elena. I was always Elena, the pianist." "Maybe that's because you let your talent become your whole identity instead of just part of it," her mother suggested. "But now you have a chance to introduce people to all the different parts of who you are." Over the next few nights, Elena found herself returning to the garage piano. At first, she told herself she was just keeping her skills sharp in case she decided to come clean about her abilities. But gradually, she admitted to herself that she was playing because she'd missed it desperately. She worked through the Chopin etude again and again, not because she needed the practice, but because it felt good to challenge herself with something she loved. She played other pieces too: Bach inventions, Debussy preludes, Rachmaninoff preludes that made her fingers dance across the keys like they were made for this music. At school, Elena found it increasingly difficult to maintain her charade of musical ignorance. When Mrs. Patterson played examples in class, Elena had to bite her tongue to keep from pointing out wrong notes or suggesting better interpretations. When her classmates struggled with basic rhythm exercises, she wanted to help them but couldn't without revealing her own knowledge. "How's the impossible piece coming along?" Ashley asked during lunch one day, 3 weeks into the assignment. "It's challenging," Elena said, which was true in ways her friend couldn't understand. "Have you been practicing on the piano in the music room?" Lily asked. "Mrs. Patterson said we could use it after school if we signed up for time slots." Elena's stomach clenched. She hadn't thought about that. If she was supposed to be learning this piece from scratch, she should be taking advantage of practice time at school. Her complete avoidance of the music room piano was probably suspicious. "I've been trying to work on other stuff first," Elena said vaguely. "You know, basic scales and things." "Smart," Jake said, joining their conversation. "You've got to crawl before you can walk, right? Although honestly, Mrs. Patterson basically asked you to run a marathon when you've never even crawled." That afternoon, Elena made a decision that she knew was risky, but felt necessary. She signed up for practice time in the music room after school. If anyone asked, she'd say she was working on fundamentals. She just needed to touch a real piano, one that was properly tuned and maintained. The music room was empty when Elena arrived at 3:30. She sat down at the beautiful grand piano, so much nicer than her garage upright, and just breathed for a moment. Then, making sure the door was closed, she began to play. She started with simple exercises just in case someone came by and heard, but gradually, she let herself play more complex pieces. Her fingers moved across the keys with fluid grace, producing sounds that filled the room with warmth and life. Elena was so lost in the music that she didn't hear the door open behind her. She didn't notice the figure standing in the doorway, listening with growing amazement to the most technically perfect and emotionally profound piano playing that had ever been heard in that classroom. She didn't realize she'd been discovered until she finished the piece and heard slow, deliberate clapping behind her. Elena turned around, her heart sinking, to find Mrs. Patterson standing in the doorway with an expression of complete shock and something that might have been anger. Well, Mrs. Patterson said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. "It seems we need to have a conversation, Miss Rodriguez." Elena's carefully constructed new life was about to come crashing down around her, and there was nowhere left to run. The silence in the music room stretched between Elena and Mrs. Patterson like a taut wire ready to snap. Elena's hands were still positioned over the piano keys, frozen in the aftermath of being caught in her elaborate deception. Mrs. Patterson walked slowly across the room, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. She pulled up a chair and sat down directly across from Elena, studying her with eyes that held a mixture of hurt, confusion, and something that might have been admiration. "That was Rachmaninoff's prelude in C-sharp minor," Mrs. Patterson said, quietly. "One of the most technically demanding pieces in classical piano literature. And you just played it flawlessly." with the kind of interpretation that takes years to develop. Elena opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could she possibly say? That she'd been lying to everyone for weeks? That she'd let her teacher assign her an impossible piece when she could have played it in her sleep? I've been teaching music for 25 years, Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice carefully controlled. I've worked with talented students, dedicated students, and yes, even prodigious students. But what I just heard, Elena, that wasn't the playing of someone who's been struggling to learn Chopin for 3 weeks. That was the playing of someone who has been seriously studying piano for years. Elena finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Mrs. Patterson, I can explain. I certainly hope so, her teacher interrupted, and now, Elena could hear the edge of anger beneath the controlled tone. Because right now I'm trying to understand why one of my students has been lying to me since the day she walked into my classroom. The word lying hit Elena like a physical blow. She told herself she was just trying to fit in, just trying to have a normal high school experience. But Mrs. Patterson was right. She had been lying to her teacher, to her classmates, and maybe most of all to herself. I never meant to lie, Elena said, tears beginning to blur her vision. I wanted to be normal. Normal? Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows shot up. Elena, what you just played was anything but normal. That level of skill, that depth of musical understanding. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How precious? Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, struggling to find the words to explain something she wasn't sure she fully understood herself. That's exactly the problem. At my old school, being good at piano wasn't precious. It was everything. It was all anyone saw when they looked at me. She took a shaky breath and continued. I started playing when I was 6. By the time I was 8, I was competing regionally. By 12, I was performing with youth orchestras. By 15, I was playing in master classes with world-renowned teachers and competing nationally. Mrs. Patterson's expression was shifting, from anger to something more complex, concern mixed with a growing understanding. I've played at Carnegie Hall, Mrs. Patterson. I've won competitions that people spend their whole lives trying to win. I've been featured in magazines and interviewed on local TV shows. And I was miserable. Elena stood up from the piano bench and began pacing, the words tumbling out now that she'd finally started telling the truth. Every day was about practice schedules and technique exercises and preparing for the next competition. I couldn't hang out with friends because I had lessons. I couldn't go to school dances because I had performances. I couldn't even play music just for fun because everything had to be perfect. Everything had to serve the goal of making me a better competitive pianist. She turned to face Mrs. Patterson, tears flowing freely now. By the time we moved here, I was having panic attacks before performances. I would wake up in the middle of the night with my heart racing, afraid that I'd forgotten how to play, afraid that I'd disappoint everyone who had invested so much in my success. Mrs. Patterson's anger was visibly melting away, replaced by the kind of compassion that had probably drawn her to teaching in the first place. Oh, Elena, she said softly. You poor child. That's not what music is supposed to be about. I know. That now? Elena said, sitting back down on the piano bench. When I started playing again in my garage at home just for myself, I remembered why I fell in love with piano in the first place. It wasn't about competitions or perfection. It was about the way music made me feel, the way it let me express things I couldn't say with words. Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, processing everything Elena had told her. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle. Elena, I owe you an apology. When I assigned you that Chopin etude, I thought I was dealing with a lazy student who wasn't applying herself. I thought giving you an impossible challenge would motivate you to try harder. She shook her head ruefully. I had no idea I was asking someone to publicly perform a piece that was connected to such painful memories. It's not your fault, Elena said quickly. You couldn't have known. And honestly, playing the Chopin again has been good for me. It reminded me that I can love that music without letting it define my entire existence. Can I ask what school you attended in California? Mrs. Patterson asked. Elena hesitated for a moment, then decided there was no point in partial truths anymore. Whitmore Academy. It's a performing arts school. Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened. Elena, I know Whitmore Academy. They only accept the most exceptional students. The fact that you were there means... She trailed off, clearly trying to process the full magnitude of Elena's deception. It means I'm probably the most qualified person in your class to play that Chopin etude, Elena finished, which makes this whole situation completely ridiculous. Despite everything, Mrs. Patterson laughed, a short, surprised sound. Ridiculous is one word for it. Elena, students at Whitmore Academy go on to study, at Juilliard, at Curtis, at the most prestigious conservatories in the world. Some of them become professional concert pianists. I know, Elena said quietly. That's what everyone expected me to do. That's what I thought I wanted. Until the pressure became so intense that I couldn't breathe. Mrs. Patterson stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the late afternoon sun slanting across the school parking lot. You know, in all my years of teaching, I've seen talented students burn out from too much pressure, but I've also seen talented students waste their gifts because they were afraid to embrace them. She turned back to Elena. The question now is, what do you want to do? Do you want to continue pretending you're someone you're not? Or do you want to find a way to be authentically yourself? Elena had been asking herself the same question for weeks. I don't know how to be both Elena the pianist and Elena the normal teenager. At my old school, it felt like I had to choose. Maybe that's because you were at a school where everyone was focused on music careers, Mrs. Patterson suggested. But this is different. Here you could be the girl who happens to be extraordinarily gifted at piano, but who also hangs out with friends and worries about history tests and goes to basketball games. What about the showcase? Elena asked. Everyone's going to wonder how I suddenly learned to play Chopin in 6 weeks. Mrs. Patterson smiled, and Elena saw a hint of mischief in her eyes. Well, that's going to depend on how you want to handle it. We could tell everyone the truth, that you've been studying piano for years and you're incredibly accomplished. Or you could give them the performance of a lifetime and let them draw their own conclusions. Sometimes the most powerful revelations are the ones people discover for themselves. Elena felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in months. Excitement about performing. Not the sick, anxious dread that had plagued her competitive performances, but genuine anticipation about sharing music with an audience. Mrs. Patterson? Elena said slowly. If I do this, if I perform the Chopin at the showcase, I need you to know that I don't want to go back to the way things were. I don't want to be pushed into competitions or advanced programs or anything that would take over my life again. Understood, Mrs. Patterson said firmly. Elena, talent is a gift, but how you choose to use that gift is entirely up to you. If you want to play piano as a hobby while you pursue other interests, that's your choice. If you want to play professionally someday, that's also your choice. But the choice should always be yours. As Elena packed up her backpack and prepared to leave the music room, she felt like a weight she'd been carrying for months was finally lifting off her shoulders. She was still nervous about the showcase, still uncertain about how her classmates would react, but for the first time since moving to Riverside, she felt like she might be able to be her whole, authentic self. Elena? Mrs. Patterson called as she reached the door. For what it's worth, I think your friends are going to be amazed. And I think you're going to remember why you fell in love with music in the first place. Elena smiled, a real, genuine smile that felt like sunshine after a long winter. I already am, Mrs. Patterson, I already am. The night of the spring showcase arrived faster than Elena had expected, bringing with it a mixture of excitement and terror that felt both foreign and familiar. She stood in the small dressing room behind the school auditorium, staring at her reflection in the mirror and trying to calm her racing heart. Unlike her competition days when she'd worn formal black concert dresses, tonight Elena had chosen a simple blue dress that made her look like any other high school student. She wanted her music to speak for itself, not her appearance or reputation. Elena, Lily's voice came through the door. Can we come in? Elena opened the door to find her 3 closest friends, Lily, Ashley, and Jake, crowding in the hallway with flowers and nervous smiles. "We wanted to wish you luck," Ashley said, handing over a small bouquet of daisies. "Though, honestly, we're all kind of terrified for you. That Chopin piece is no joke." Elena accepted the flowers with a smile that felt more genuine than any she'd worn in months. These friends had no idea what they were about to witness, but they cared about her enough to bring flowers and moral support. That meant everything. "How are you feeling?" Jake asked. "Please tell me you've been practicing." "I've been practicing," Elena said, which was completely true, even if not in the way they imagined. "Well, whatever happens, we're proud of you for trying," Lily said, giving Elena a quick hug. "Mrs. Patterson was crazy to give you such an impossible piece, but you've been working so hard on it." Elena felt a familiar pang of guilt about her deception, but it was tempered now by her conversation with Mrs. Patterson. Tonight she would finally be completely honest with everyone, including herself. "I should probably go warm up," Elena said. "But thank you guys for this, it means more than you know." After her friends left, Elena made her way to the piano in the side room where performers were warming up before going on stage. The familiar weight of piano keys under her fingers felt like greeting an old friend. She ran through a few scales and arpeggios, not because she needed the practice, but because the routine calmed her nerves. Through the thin walls, she could hear the audience, gathering in the auditorium. Parents, teachers, and students filled the seats, creating a buzz of conversation and anticipation that Elena remembered from countless past performances. "Elena?" Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway, looking elegant in a black dress that Elena realized was probably her own concert attire from years past. "How are you feeling?" "Nervous," Elena admitted. "But good nervous, if that makes sense. Like I'm excited to play music for people instead of afraid of disappointing them." Mrs. Patterson smiled warmly. "That's exactly how it should feel. Elena, I want you to know that whatever happens tonight, I'm proud of you for choosing to be brave." "Thank you," Elena said. "For everything. For pushing me, even when you thought I was someone else. For listening when I finally told you the truth. For helping me figure out how to be myself." The first half of the showcase flew by in a blur of performances. Elena watched from the wings as her classmates took their turns on stage. Ashley sang beautifully, her voice clear and confident. Jake's drum solo got the audience clapping along. Lily's rendition of Für Elise was careful and precise, exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd been working hard on a piece just at the edge of her ability level. Then Mrs. Patterson was announcing the final performance of the evening. "Our last performer tonight is Elena Rodriguez, who will be playing Chopin's Etude Op. 10. Number 4 in C-sharp minor." Elena heard a ripple of surprised murmurs from the audience. She knew some of her classmates' parents were musicians themselves and would recognize the significance of that piece title. Taking a deep breath, Elena walked onto the stage and sat down at the beautiful grand piano that dominated the center of the space. The stage lights were warm on her face, and she could see the audience as a sea of expectant faces beyond the bright illumination. She adjusted the bench height out of habit, then placed her hands gently on the keys. For a moment, she just sat there, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't a competition. There were no judges with scorecards, no rankings or prizes at stake. This was just Elena, sharing music she loved with people who cared about her. The first notes of the Chopin Etude rang out clear and precise, and Elena felt herself settle into the familiar rhythm of performance. But this time was different from any performance she'd ever given. Instead of focusing on technical perfection or impressing judges, Elena found herself simply enjoying the music. Her hands moved across the keys with fluid grace, navigating the treacherous passages that made this piece so feared by pianists. The rapid scales sparkled under her fingers, each note perfectly placed and weighted. The dynamic contrasts painted emotional landscapes that took the audience on a journey from whispered intimacy to soaring passion. But what made this performance special wasn't just Elena's technical mastery. It was the joy that radiated from every phrase. She played like someone who had rediscovered her love for music after a long absence, like someone who was finally free to express herself without fear or pressure. In the audience, Elena's friend sat in stunned silence. This wasn't the struggling beginner they'd expected to see fumbling through an impossible piece. This was a masterclass in piano performance, delivered by the quiet girl they thought they knew. Elena's parents, who had driven over from their house despite Elena's protests that it was just a school thing, sat with tears streaming down their faces. They recognized their daughter's gift, of course, but they also heard something new, a lightness and freedom in her playing that had been missing for years. Mrs. Patterson watched from the wings with a mixture of pride and amazement. She'd known Elena was accomplished, but seeing her perform with such confidence and artistry was breathtaking. This wasn't just a talented student. This was a young artist coming into her own. As Elena reached the final cascade of notes, building to the piece's dramatic conclusion, she felt a surge of pure joy that had nothing to do with competition or achievement. This was why she'd fallen in love with piano in the first place, for moments like this when music became a language that could express things words never could. The final chord rang out into silence, and for a heartbeat, the entire auditorium held its breath. Then the applause erupted like thunder, people leaping to their feet in genuine amazement and appreciation. Elena stood and took a bow, but instead of the professional smile she'd perfected for competitions, she wore an expression of genuine happiness. She caught sight of her friends in the audience, Lily with her mouth hanging open, Ashley clapping so hard her hands had to hurt, and Jake shaking his head in disbelief. As Elena walked off the stage, Mrs. Patterson was waiting for her with a huge smile. That, she said, was exactly what music is supposed to be about. The next morning at school, Elena braced herself for the inevitable questions and reactions. She wasn't sure what to expect. Anger from friends who felt deceived, unwanted attention from people who now saw her as the school's resident prodigy, or pressure to return to the competitive world she'd tried so hard to escape. What she found instead was a pleasant surprise. "Okay," Lily said, approaching Elena's locker with Ashley and Jake in tow. "We need to talk. But first, that was absolutely incredible last night. I mean, jaw-droppingly, mind-blowingly amazing." "Thanks," Elena said cautiously, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "So obviously you've been playing piano for way longer than you let on," Ashley continued. "And while we're definitely curious about why you felt like you couldn't tell us, we're not mad. We just want to understand." Elena felt a wave of relief wash over her. "I was scared you'd think I was lying to you. Which I guess I was, in a way." "Everyone has stuff they don't talk about," Jake said with a shrug. "The important thing is that you're our friend, whether you're a piano genius or tone deaf." Elena spent the next few minutes giving them the abbreviated version of her story, the years of intensive training, the pressure, the burnout, and her decision to start fresh at Riverside High. "That makes so much sense," Lily said when Elena finished. "I mean, you always seem to know way more about music than you let on in class. And you always looked kind of sad when Mrs. Patterson would play classical pieces," Ashley added. "I thought you just didn't like that kind of music, but now I realize you probably missed playing it yourself." "So what happens now?" Jake asked. "Are you going back to competitions and all that?" Elena shook her head firmly. "No, that life wasn't healthy for me. But I'm not going to pretend I can't play anymore either. Mrs. Patterson and I talked about maybe helping some of the younger music students with their technique, and I might perform occasionally when I feel like it. But it's going to be on my terms." "That sounds perfect," Lily said. "You get to use your gift without letting it take over your life." As they walked to their first class together, Elena realized that her worst fears about revealing her secret hadn't materialized. Her friends still saw her as Elena first and pianist second. She was still invited to lunch tables and basketball games and all the normal teenage activities she'd craved, but now she could also be honest about the part of herself that lived and breathed music. When Mrs. Patterson played examples in class, Elena could participate fully. When her friends struggled with rhythm or pitch,